Welcome back to the Brahmin Word, and we are finally at the birth of Isaac. Has finally arrived. Isaac has finally arrived on the scene, and it is just what a great point in the history of Israel, but also the history of the Bible, that you have 100-year-old and a 90-year-old having a child. Just what a miraculous point that is. But also, it continues this idea that we are going through the seed of Adam and Eve eventually to the Messiah. And we're getting there to that point. And with Isaac, we kind of see a little hint of that, which we will see as we go along with the life of Abraham. As Isaac is getting older. But today we are looking at the birth of Isaac, but then the consequence of that when it comes to the relationship between Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael. So turn with me, Genesis chapter 21. Genesis chapter 21. We're going to start in verse 1. We're going to go through verses 1 through 21 today. So, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of the son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac, which Isaac means he laughs. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Remember in chapter 17. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And it doesn't mean we'll laugh at her. It's a joyful laughter. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Because again, she was around 90 at the birth of Isaac. So you have this just incredible points in history. Just so much joy being seen here. But the one thing that I want to point out is the idea of God keeping his promises, even if it's not in the same time frame that we are thinking of, whether it be a woman in Sarah's shoes that thinks that she would have children in her 20s, but instead she has her first and only child at 90 years old. It's crazy how the Lord works, but he keeps his promises. Verse 1, as he had promised. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said. It's just what testimony that is to the promise keeping God that you and I serve as believers. And what a beautiful picture that is. And it's cool too to see that Abraham does not mess around when it comes to the covenant that he agreed with the Lord, which part of that was the sign of circumcision. And so when Isaac was 8 days old, he was circumcised, just as the covenant that God had with Abraham, that we talked about in chapter 17, again shows. And again, I think the idea of laughter here is really, really important. Yes, we're talking about the laughter of Abraham. Yes, we're talking about the laughter of Sarah when they were both told by the angel that they would still have a son in their old age. Yes, that's totally true. And I think that's definitely there. But I think it's also this laughter of joy idea as well, which we see again in Sarah's proclamation in verses 6 and 7. Just this idea of I'm laughing because I'm joyful, but I'm laughing because the impossible just happened. Who would have thought, or who would have said to me that this could have happened in verse 7? So, what beautiful, beautiful moments. And you're thinking, okay, great. No more Sodom and Gomorrah tears, nothing like that. It's all done. The promised son is here. Everything's good. Yeah, there is two, though, that now there's this big question about what will happen to them, and that is Hagar and Ishmael. Because just because Ishmael was born, that doesn't mean that they were sent away. They have been through, they have been with Abraham through everything since then until now. So, verse 8, turn with me there. And the child grew, the child being Isaac, and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Uh, and I think in this one, if you look at the ancient language, it's not a joyful laughter. It is a insulting laughter. And what could she have been laughing at with mockery? It's possible that she could have been making fun of her, um, of Sarah. Hagar could have been making fun of Sarah with just the fact that, oh my gosh, you're a mother and 90 years old. That's not usually what happens. Like, oh, how are you going to get through this kind of thing? Um, that could be maybe what the mockery laughter is all about. But anyway, Sarah sees that, and that kind of sets her off. Verse 10. So Sarah said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. So here's so you have this rift, and it's not new, right? We've seen with Hagar and with Ishmael, Sarah's not really had the greatest relationship with them, even though she was the one that wanted Abraham to have a child with Hagar in the first place. Um, but again, sin is very, very dangerous, and um, and it impacts so many different people. And I'm not talking about the sin of adultery necessarily of Hagar and Abraham, which really, I mean, it was consensual because Sarah, they both, Abraham and Sarah both agreed to this, but it's more so the sin of Sarah not sticking up for um, her husband and trusting in the Lord that this son of promise is coming. But instead, she decides, you know what, I'm going to take this into my own hands, and I'm going to have Abraham uh, have a child with Hagar instead. Well, now it's coming full circle, and and there's a lot of animosity there, and this whole thing is just getting on Abraham's nerves, as we see in verse 11. And I think on account of his son, I think he's talking about Ishmael. I think he understands that there is this rift between the two, and he's worried about his son Ishmael and how might that impact him, which I find interesting. So, but God does show up, of course, as he does, and he gives Abraham a word of encouragement about this. Verse 12. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave women, so Ishmael and Hagar. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So basically, God is saying, look, don't be worried about Ishmael. I have set him up just as I am setting up Isaac for prosperity and that he will be safe. I'm going to do the same thing for Ishmael as well. And so it's basically this word of encouragement to Abraham that Ishmael will be okay. So Abraham does this. Verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, Ishmael, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. So you have this point where they are given their leave of the family. They are basically kicked out of the family, but there is this promise from the Lord that he will watch over Ishmael, even though Ishmael is not the son of promise, which is Isaac. He is still the son of Abraham, which means that God is very much going to look after them. And I think it's important to see here too. It's not just because he is the son of Abraham, even though that has a lot to do with it. God is going to show his grace um, to Hagar. And I think it's interesting too how this is portrayed. So you have the child not doing well. And yet God promised to Abraham that Ishmael would be okay. So we know that's going to be the case, but it looks pretty hopeless. They're in the wilderness, they're on their own. Their resources are dwindling. So what's going to happen to them? Well, let's find out. Verse 17. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." So this is really fascinating, I think, because at the end of verse 16, it says, she lifted up her voice and wept. And yet, God heard the voice of the boy, according to the first part of verse 17. So it's really fascinating to me that God is directly saying that the reason why Hagar is crying out is because of the boy. Well, so he goes directly to the boy. Now, what is what was Ishmael saying? We don't know. But yet God hears. And I think too, when it says he hears, I think, yes, it's talking about audible, but I think he's also feeling the outcries of Hagar and Ishmael, even if they're not crying and out loud like Hagar is. It could be that Ishmael is crying out in his soul to himself in his mind, and yet God hears that. So I think that's really, really interesting. And so he tells them to get up and that he will make Ishmael into a great nation. Verse 19, then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, and became an expert with a bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So, you have this kind of come full circle where the son that was not promised, but yet gave Abraham a son, eventually is kicked out of the party of Abraham, but is not forgotten. He is watched over by God to the point where not only is he delivered in the wilderness from starvation um, and from dehydration, but he's also given a future as well, with the fact that he's able to live. He's he lives in the wilderness. So yes, it's not a city, but it is a home. And then he becomes an expert with a bow. So he's given a skill. And then finally, he is given a family in verse 21 as he takes a wife of his own and eventually has children of his own, which becomes a great nation and becomes eventually the start of the Islamic or the Muslim religion. Ishmael is kind of the start of that, which of course they see Abraham as their forefather as well. But for me, it's interesting to see. Yeah, it's interesting to see just how God protects not just the son of promise, Isaac, but um, he also protects those that cry out to him in the wilderness as well. So, with that, we have finally come to the Son of Promise, which is really, really just what a great point that is. We will see one more side account before we get into the infamous chapter 22 when it comes to the sacrifice of Isaac, or the almost sacrifice of Isaac, and we'll dive into that next week. So with that, thanks for spending time with me today at the Brahmin Word, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.